Ladies and gentlemen, Mr. Joel Richardson.
Okay, this next session, session 3, the Islamic Empire in the book of Daniel. Now, in session 1, I mentioned that those who argue for the Roman end-time theory argue their case primarily from 4 passages. Daniel 2, Daniel 7, Daniel 9, and Revelation 17. We're going to go ahead and we're going to discuss Daniel 2, which is really the most important of all of the above, again because it comes first and it sets the pace for those passages that follow. We're going to go ahead and jump right in. This is the story of Nebuchadnezzar's dream, Nebuchadnezzar's statue. Now, as the story goes, King Nebuchadnezzar was the king of Babylon. He was the ruler of all of ancient Mesopotamia. And he had a dream, and he knew it was more than just your standard pizza dream. He knew that it was of divine origin, and it disturbed him very much. So he went ahead and he called all of his Babylonian wise men, all of his magi, his court jesters, and he said, here's the challenge. I want you to tell me the interpretation of my dream, but beyond that, I want you to tell me the dream itself. How's that for a challenge? So all of the king's horses and all of the king's men were incapable of meeting the King Nebuchadnezzar's challenge. So there was a young Hebrew eunuch that had a reputation for being very good at interpreting dreams and solving mysteries and this sort of thing. So Daniel was called in. He was still a young man at the time. Daniel was called in. The issue was challenged. He went, he prayed, and the Lord of creation revealed the mystery to Daniel. So Daniel came back to King Nebuchadnezzar, and this is where we pick it up. Daniel 2, verse 31 through 35. Daniel is speaking. You, O king, were looking, and behold, there was a single great statue. That statue, which was large and of extraordinary splendor, was standing in front of you, and its appearance was awesome. The head of that statue was made of fine gold, its breast and its arms of silver, its belly and its thighs of bronze, its legs of iron, its feet partly of iron, partly of clay. You continued looking until a stone was cut out without human hands. It was cut out. It struck the statue on its feet of iron and clay, and it crushed them. Then the iron, the clay, the bronze, the silver, the gold were crushed all at the same time, and they became like chaff from the summer threshing floors, and the wind carried them away, so that not a trace of them was found. On the other hand, the stone that struck the statue on the feet grew and became a great mountain and filled the earth. Immediately, Daniel then launches into the interpretation. He says, You, O king, are the King of kings. The God of heaven has given you dominion and power and might and glory. You are the head of gold. So what Daniel begins to explain to King Nebuchadnezzar is that this statue, this great statue that was composed of 4 or arguably 5 distinct elemental components, each segment represents a different empire and a different emperor, a different kingdom, a different king. And he explains to King Nebuchadnezzar, you're the head of gold. So the statue begins with the head representing the kingdom of Babylon. And then he says, but after you, other empires will rise up in your place and replace you. Okay? Now, throughout the history of the church, the primary interpretation of this passage has been this. the identification of the four empires that this passage is speaking about has been the following. Number one is the Babylonian Empire. Number two is the Medo-Persian Empire. The book of Daniel actually records the night when Belshazzar, the grandson of Nebuchadnezzar, was having a party, and he was actually getting drunk, drinking out of the utensils that had been stolen from the Jewish temple. And then the famous story, the hand appears, there's handwriting on the wall, and Daniel comes forward and he says, listen, your kingdom is about to be replaced. And that very night, the Medes and the Persians, or Cyrus the Persian, came and they conquered the city of Babylon, and the empire of Babylon fell. After that came Alexander the Great. He swept out of Macedonia in Europe, Asia Minor, Turkey, Greece, and he swept across the Middle East. And he conquered the Persian Empire all the way to India. Now, the fourth identification that most have held throughout the history of the church is that the fourth empire, the legs of iron, represent the Roman Empire. This is far and away the majority position throughout the history of the church. And I want to talk about a few reasons why I believe that is completely wrong. Image 5 is one of those classic pictures of the statue. You know, every end-time book does its best to do an artistic rendition. So there you see the historical, classical interpretation. The Babylonian through Roman succession. The Babylonian through Roman succession. I want to talk about... Now, I agree, let me just make this very clear. I agree with the identification of the first three empires. I want to talk about why the identification of the fourth empire as the Roman Empire is completely impossible. Biblically, it is impossible. Problem number one, I'm going to introduce this kind of slowly and I'm going to build on it. The first problem with identifying the Roman Empire as the legs of iron is that it fails to take into consideration the proper context of this passage. For any of you who have gone to Bible school or seminary, or for any of you who are just careful students in Sunday school, you've all heard your teacher say this over and over and again. The first and most important issue that needs to be established when you are attempting to responsibly and correctly interpret any passage is you need to establish what? Context. Context, context, context. The Babylonian through Roman succession, get this, is only true through the Western lens of history. Okay? I want to say this. It took me a long time to shift. I used to believe that the Roman Empire was the fourth. It took me a long time to shift. I'm going to try to introduce this gradually, so bear with me. We in the West, again, are very egocentric. We really believe the world revolves around us, especially Americans. And as such, we trace our history through the history of the Roman Empire. We've received so much from the Roman Empire in terms of law and just all sorts of things. Now, the problem is, again, what is the context of this passage? This passage is what? It's a dream, right? The context of this passage is a dream. Whose dream was it? It was King Nebuchadnezzar's dream. It was not a dream that was given to Daniel. It was a dream that was given to King Nebuchadnezzar, who was the king of Babylon, the ruler of ancient Mesopotamia. The dream, geographically speaking, it took place in modern-day Iraq, very close to Baghdad. I'm going to begin to try to explain this to you. Here's the Babylonian Empire. Now, what I did is I drew a circle several hundred miles around ground zero, the geographic context of this passage, where it took place. Now, again, I need to remind you, what was the interpretation of the dream? The dream was given to explain to King Nebuchadnezzar those empires that would come to succeed his empire. right? The dream was about those empires that would succeed him, that would come after him. So here you have the first empire, the Babylonian Empire, the head of gold, if you will. Let's go to the next map. After the Babylonian Empire fell, the Persian, or the Medo-Persian Empire, replaced the Babylonian Empire. And it came to dominate the entire Middle East. Now, as you look at that, it's very clear that the Persian Empire clearly replaced the Babylonian Empire. Then came Alexander, next map. Again, his empire swept out of Macedonia. That's all the way over there on the western edge of the map. He swept all the way across to India, and again, clearly conquered the ancient location of Babylon. Okay? Then came the Roman Empire. That's the next map. Now, the Roman Empire was primarily a European entity, but it did extend well into the Middle East. But in truth, it was significantly a much more Western empire than the others, wasn't it? You know, if you're to compare the Roman Empire to the Persian Empire or the Alexandrian Greek Empire, things shifted to the West significantly, didn't they? And the Roman Empire really didn't conquer ancient Babylon. Now, to be fair, while you're looking there at the section in blue, that's the Roman Empire, those boundaries in AD 116 did extend down the Euphrates River, and it reached Babylon for a couple of months. In AD 116, under Emperor Trajan, the Roman Empire fought its way down to Babylon. It established a few garrisons, and then within a couple months, Emperor Trajan died, and they completely withdrew. They completely left the area. Okay, now I'm going to begin to get a little bit more specific. I'm going to build on this theme, but I'm going to get a little bit more specific. The second problem with identifying Rome as the legs of iron is that it fails to meet the criterion of Daniel 2:35. Let's read this verse. Daniel speaking to King Nebuchadnezzar, "While you are watching, a rock was cut out, not by human hands. It struck the statue on its feet of iron and clay and smashed them." Now, this is speaking about the kingdom of Christ, the kingdom of God. At the end of the age, after all of these empires have arisen on the face of the earth, Jesus himself will return and establish his kingdom over the earth. That is the mountain, that is the empire that is cut out not with human hands. It's the divine empire. And it smashes the statue on its feet. Now follow this. Then the iron, that's the legs of iron, whichever empire that is, the clay, the bronze, that's the Greek Empire, the silver, that's the Persian Empire, and the gold, the Babylonian Empire, were broken to pieces at the same time. At the same time. And they became like chaff on the threshing floor, and they blew away, and there was nothing left to them. Nothing remained of those empires. Now, let's go ahead and even, just for reference, let's jump back, slide number 10. There's the Roman Empire. If that empire was crushed and destroyed, would the Medo-Persian Empire, the Greek Empire, and the Babylonian Empire all by virtue also be destroyed at the same time? Or would only some small western sections of them be destroyed? Do you see where I'm trying to get? There was another empire that arose that very well could meet the criterion and that could meet the descriptions, the biblical descriptions of the Fourth Empire. Now I want to get even more specific. Problem number 3. This is where we're getting as specific as we can. Daniel 2:40. The Roman Empire does not meet the criterion of Daniel 2:40. It doesn't meet the biblically described description of what the Fourth Empire must fulfill in order to be the candidate to be the fourth empire. Daniel 2:40. Follow this. There will be a fourth kingdom, strong as iron, for iron breaks and smashes everything. And as iron breaks things to pieces, so it will crush and break all of the others. Again, in its destruction, in the previous passage there of Daniel 2:35, you can see that there was an overlap, if you will. Now here in its conquering, you can see which nations we're to be looking at. Okay? It will crush and break all the others. Now follow this. Did the Roman Empire crush and break the Babylonian Empire, the Medo-Persian Empire, and the Greek Empire? This is important because if the Roman Empire does not fulfill this description, then how can we claim that this is what the passage is talking about? Okay, now let's look at map number 13. Okay, again for reiteration. There is the Roman Empire. Geographically speaking, did the Roman Empire conquer Babylon? It really didn't. Did it conquer the Medo-Persian Empire? It conquered some of the western sections. But again, it's significantly to the west. It touches them. It touches some of their peripherals. You know, the Roman Empire's greatest extent eastward touches some of the other empires' greatest extent westward. But in terms of overlap, it's fairly minimal. Let's talk a little bit about what crush means. What does it mean to crush? I've heard it said that when it's speaking about crushing, they say, well, this perfectly describes the Roman Empire. This perfectly describes the Roman Empire because their military crushed the people that they conquered. The truth of it is that the Roman Empire actually added government, law, roads, infrastructure. There was a lot that they actually added to the various peoples that they conquered. Let's look at the next map. This is the Islamic Empire. After Muhammad died in the 7th century, his companion and friend Abu Bakr became his successor, his caliph. He was the Pope of Islam, if you will. Although far more than a pope, he was the military, political, and religious leader of the Muslim world. And that empire burst forth out of Arabia and very quickly conquered significant portions of the world, all of the Middle East. Now, just in a geographic sense, between Rome and the Islamic Empire, which empire, geographically speaking, is more likely to be the candidate that conquered Babylon, Persia, and Greece? Looking at the maps, would you say that the Islamic Empire or the Roman Empire is better suited to be the fulfillment of this passage? Let's look at the next map. There's a world map where the nations that are, it's a little bit hard to see. The dark green are the nations that are primarily Muslim nations in this day. I mean, it's hard for me to understand how we can almost be so oblivious to the reality that's just right in front of us. The Roman Empire has been completely gone for over 500 years. At that time, when Christ returns, he will specifically destroy an empire and replace it with his own. And at that time, when Christ returns, the empire that he destroys will also, by virtue, destroy all of the others. And yet somehow we are looking to Europe, the most toothless grouping of nations that history has ever known. We are expected to believe will suddenly arise as the iron-toothed beast of Daniel 7. The toothless will get ruthless all of a sudden. Let's talk a little bit more about what crush really means. Slide number 16. Some of you will like this one. Michael Savage, a nutty but brilliant individual, the subtitle, you can't see the subtitle to his book, but he gave us this phrase. He said, how the liberals are trying to destroy America's borders, language, and culture. And he's put together this phrase, border, language, culture. And he said, these are the issues that define a people. Now, in my opinion, when the Bible is talking about crushing, rather than looking at it as mere military brutality, I think we are far better served to see crushing as the crushing of borders, religions, cultures, languages. Now let me ask you this question. Did the Roman Empire destroy the Babylonian borders? Did it conquer the Babylonian borders? I don't think it did. I mean, obviously it didn't. Did it replace the Babylonian gods with Roman gods? No, it didn't. Now, what about the Greek Empire? Did the Roman Empire crush the Greek Empire? Well, what history tells us is that after Alexander died, the 15 Greek generals under Alexander, they started to duke it out for control of the empire until there was only 4 left. And when there were 4 left, they divided up the Greek Empire into 4 sections, and basically what you had was a degraded version of the former Greek Empire. And then, a few hundred years later, the Roman Empire basically just stepped in and filled the void. It wasn't some great battle. It wasn't some, significant conquering. They just basically filled the void. And the Roman Empire most certainly did not conquer the Greek gods. They just adopted the same gods, called them by different names. Jupiter became Zeus. But they worshiped the same gods. In terms of language, was Latin suddenly enforced throughout the whole Middle East? Or did the Greek language actually come to engulf, did Greek culture and language come to engulf much of the Roman Empire? The truth of it is, in 1st century, when Jesus was walking the Middle East, it was under Roman hegemony. What did they speak? They spoke Greek. The New Testament was written in Greek. Greek Hellenistic culture was not conquered or crushed by the Roman Empire. Yes, they did take over much of their western borders. That's about the best that can be said. What about the Islamic Empire? When the Islamic Empire burst forth out of Arabia, can it be fairly said that it crushed the Babylonian Empire? When we talk about Babylon, we're talking about Iraq. Did the Islamic Empire crush Iraq geographically? Yes. Did it crush it culturally? Did it replace the religious systems and the religious beliefs of those peoples with Islam? Absolutely. What do they speak in Iraq these days? They speak Arabic. What about the Persian Empire? Well, they certainly crushed it geographically, as we saw on the map. And while the Persians today do maintain their language of Farsi, their language has been Arabized. They use the Arabic alphabet. Religiously, Islam is the religion of Persia. The former religion of Zoroastrianism is a tiny, tiny minority. And the Greek Empire as well was crushed by the Islamic Empire. And when we look at the religion of Islam, we see that unlike any other force in the history of the world, it is a crushing influence. When Islam moves into an area, the first thing they do is they establish dominance. And when they establish that dominance, they begin to remove and erase former cultures. Recently in Kosovo, when Kosovo was given over to the greater Albania and the Muslim majority, the first thing they did is they started ripping crosses off the churches. These ancient Eastern Orthodox churches. You can go on YouTube and just watch these videos of hundreds of people storming the churches, burning the churches. Today, there's a small hamlet in London called Tower Hamlets. And it's actually a minority, but what you have there now is about a 20% Bangladeshi population of Muslims. But what's ironic is that of the counselors in Tower Hamlets, 35 of the 51 are Muslims. And now several of the voting districts that were once named with names such as Trinity, St. Mary's, they're not called by those names anymore. They're called by names such as Abu Ali. There's a cemetery in that area that was, I believe it was called St. Mary's. And now the name of the cemetery is called Abu Ali Cemetery. Street names are changed. Churches are closed down because of street violence. And yet this is only a 20%. This is only a 20% population. And these Anglican priests, they don't know what to do. And actually, there's several churches in that area that have been closed down. And this is the area that the Salvation Army began. This is where John Wesley preached. This place with a rich Christian history is very quickly being erased, and it's being Arabized. Okay? Islam is very, very much an Arab supremacist force. Muslims will argue otherwise, but history shows that to be true. Why do they speak Arabic in Egypt? Why do they speak Arabic all the way across Africa? Why do they speak Arabic in Iraq? Islam is an Arabizing force. In Sudan today, why are the Arab Muslims killing the African Muslims? It's hard to understand. I want to look at a very specific hint that's found in Daniel 2:43. This is slide number 18. The book of Daniel, the whole Old Testament was written in Hebrew, but the book of Daniel, Nehemiah, and some of these post-exilic books were written in Aramaic. So there's been a lot of discussion over the years, a lot of debate on how to interpret some of these passages. Especially the book of Daniel has a handful of fairly cryptic passages, and there's been quite a variety of interpretations that have come out. But I want to zero in on this verse in particular, and again, it's speaking of the Fourth Empire. Now pay attention to this. Daniel says to King Nebuchadnezzar, just as you saw the iron mixed with the baked clay. Now he's speaking of the final manifestation of the Fourth Empire. He's speaking of the empire that will be crushed by the kingdom of Christ when Christ returns. Just as you saw the iron mixed with baked clay, so the people will be a mixture, and they will not remain united any more than iron mixes with clay. Now here's what's interesting. The specific word for mixed in that passage in Aramaic is Arab. The Arab people in Hebrew thought, in Middle Eastern thought, were known as mixed peoples. We have the biblical account where the sons of Esau were intermarrying with the sons of Ishmael, and they were intermarrying with the people of the East. The Arabs were viewed as a people, basically the Eastern peoples, the Eastern roaming Bedouin peoples that were intermarrying. And the word Arab and mixed became synonymous. If you were Arab, you were viewed as a mixed one. And so here we have this passage, and it's very cryptic. Even as you saw the iron mixed with clay, so the people will be a mixture. And it's very confusing until you understand the nature of the book of Daniel. And so a literal interpretation of this passage could read, just as you saw the iron mixed with baked clay, so the people will be Arab, and they will not remain united any more than iron mixes with clay. Now, am I grasping at straws? Am I trying to read something into the passage that's not there? Or is there precedent for this in the book of Daniel? You see, ancient Eastern poetry, prophetic poetry, often uses rhymes and plays on words. This is very common to this type of literature. We can't miss it. It will be an Arab kingdom. It will be a mixed kingdom. These are synonyms. Does the book of Daniel ever do this type of thing? You're all familiar with this. Again, the handwriting on the wall. Mene, mene, tekel, parsin. again, Nebuchadnezzar's grandson. He's getting drunk, drinking out of the temple vessels. And this handwriting appears on the wall. Who gets called in to interpret it? Daniel. And this is Daniel's interpretation. He goes down. He says, God has numbered the days of your reign, and now it's come to an end. And then he gets to that word Perez, and he says, your kingdom is divided and given to the Paras, the Persians. So he takes this word, Perez, and he says, this is the meaning. Perez means divided, but there's a play on words, and it's referring to the specific people that will conquer your kingdom, the Persians. He says, Paras, your kingdom will be given to the Paras. And then there in Daniel 2:43, we have a very similar verse. Just as you saw that the iron was mixed with clay, it's a word play, so the kingdom will be Arab. I think it's a hint. I think it's a pretty clear hint. Hint number 2. Another description of the fourth empire. In that you saw the feet and toes, partly of potter's clay and partly of iron, it will be a divided kingdom. Again, another primary description of the kingdom. The Lord is trying to help us zero in on the identity of the fourth kingdom, and He gives us this very important clue. It will be a divided kingdom. After Muhammad died, a dispute immediately broke out. Who would be his successor? Would it be his companions, or would his successors come from his family, from the party of Ali, the Shia? Those who said that it would go to his companions were known as the Sunnis, or they've become known as the Sunnis. Those who believed that it should go to Ali became the Shia. From the very inception of Islam, it has been a divided empire. And there are perhaps no better descriptions that could be used to refer to the Islamic Ummah, the Muslim community, other than a divided community. I mean, it is perfect. It could not be more perfect. And yet, people go, well, you did have the Eastern and the Western Roman Empire, but again, that defined portions, periods of the Roman Empire, but it's certainly not a description that could be applied throughout the history of the empire. But it describes the Islamic empire perfectly. And then we see in a few passages regarding the Antichrist armies at that time when they are attacking Israel, at that time when Christ is returning to defend them, we see that this characteristic is played out. I will call for a sword against him on all my mountains, declares the Lord God. Now get this, this is the army of the Antichrist. Every man's sword will be against his brother. Does this sound like something that we are familiar with? What does it look like in Iraq today? Every man's sword will be against his brother. Who are killing who? Who are, launching all of these, well, you're an apostate. No, you're an apostate. No, you're kufr. No, you are. Zechariah 14:3, on that day, men will be stricken by the Lord. Again, this is the battle of Armageddon with a great panic. Every man will seize the hand of another, and they will attack each other. The armies of the Antichrist will actually, for a time, lay aside their differences for their mutual hatred of Israel. They'll come together to attack Israel. But even in the midst of that, they'll be killing each other, and this will be from the Lord. The empire will be divided. The empire is divided. It will remain so. The fourth kingdom, I would argue, is the Islamic Caliphate, the Islamic Caliphate. It's the only empire throughout the history that matches all of the very specific criteria that the Bible's given us. The Roman Empire really doesn't. I mean, you can kind of try to make it work, but it just doesn't do it. Now, I want to say that I am clearly taking a position which is contrary to the dominant position of the church down through history. And that scares me, okay? Who am I? Who am I to stand against the collective wisdom of great men of God down throughout the history of the church? In Daniel 12, verses 5 through 13, the angel gives some parting messages, if you will, to Daniel. And this is what he says. He says, "But you, Daniel, close up and seal the words of the scroll until the time of the end. Many will go here and there, and knowledge will increase." And then Daniel says, "I heard, but I did not understand. So I asked, 'My Lord, what will be the outcome of this?' And he replied, 'Daniel, go your way, because the words are closed up and sealed until the end of time. Many will be purified, made spotless and refined, but the wicked will continue to be wicked. None of the wicked will understand, but those who are wise will understand. As for you, go your way until the end. You will rest, and at the end of days you will rise to receive your allotted inheritance.'" Now, I hope I'm not reading too much into this, but it seems to me that when he says the book is sealed until the time of the end, that what he's saying is this book is sealed. The primary emphasis of this book until the time of the end, the time when the resurrection occurs, it's sealed. Now, if that's the case, if this book is sealed, and if this verse means anything at all, then doesn't it also stand to reason that the majority position that has been held by nearly everybody throughout history is probably the least likely interpretation to be right? Doesn't it stand to reason that if everybody believes this, that this passage doesn't mean anything? If everybody understands this book, if it's so clear, if it's so clearly Rome, then this verse, at the very least, it's not meaning what it says. But if indeed this scroll has been purposefully closed by the Lord until the end, when, because of just natural circumstances in the earth and through the release of revelation, the Lord would begin to open up the meaning of this book to His church, and suddenly you look at it and you go, this makes way more sense. How could we have missed this? How could we have missed this huge empire right in our face? How could it be more clear? There's another pretty dramatic implication to all of this. If what I'm suggesting is right, and again, I set it before you as Bereans to think about, to chew on, but if what I'm articulating is true, then that also means this, that the end times are upon us. That means that we're actually somehow entering into the end times. I mean, is that the only logical conclusion? I'm going to end it right there.